So this is the second of a series of webinars that we've been carrying out for creative care, and this one is going to be focusing in upon sensory behaviours. So we've talked, I think in the first webinar we were looking at a sort of behavioural function. Last month I was looking at sort of incident report recordings, so those videos should be available to you guys if you weren't able to attend those. Today we're going to be focusing in on, as I say, those sensory behaviours. So that's the subject matter today. So we're going to start off by having a look at a recap on the behavioural function, why it is that we're focusing in upon those sensory behaviours. We're going to look a little bit at some of the neurological differences in relation to sensory behaviours and sensory experiences. But then going to look at the senses, how many senses there are. We're going to be talking about these things called hyper and hypo sensitivity, and how those have an impact on sort of the way that people perceive the world and may behave. We're going to be looking at some of those, how those sensory differences might present as behaviour, and give some examples of some of the behaviours that you might see in people who are experiencing those slightly different sensory perceptions. And then we're going to conclude by having a bit of a think around our understanding of those behaviours and how we might go about supporting people who are experiencing the world differently from a sensory perspective. So this is what we're going to be covering, and obviously there's going to be a chance for you guys at the end to ask questions, but also if you want to ask any questions sort of at the moment, then by all means pop those into the chat, or if you're brave enough you can speak to me, that's absolutely fine too. If you could pop yourselves onto mute as well, and that would be really helpful when I'm talking, just because while you're generally pretty quiet, if there's sort of background noise and that kind of thing, it can sort of interfere with the ability for other people to take in the information. Fantastic. Okay, so just a little bit of a recap. Some of you guys, if you've been on any of the PBS training, or if you have sort of been in the session that Tia ran around behavioural function, this isn't going to be brand spanking new to you, but I just wanted to, we're talking about sensory behaviours from the sort of positive behaviour support side of things here, and obviously function is a really important part of that. And what we mean by function is the purpose that behaviour is serving for that person. So all behaviours serve a purpose. They all serve a purpose for that individual. Otherwise they wouldn't do them in the first place. And it's about understanding what that purpose is, what that function of that behaviour is. That will go about sort of enabling us to know how to support that person more effectively. Positive behaviour support is about illumination, so about understanding the meanings and purposes behind those behaviours rather than just elimination. We're not simply focusing on getting rid of behaviours that are causing a concern. We're looking at trying to understand them better. If we can understand why that person is doing what they're doing, what it is that they're getting out of that particular action, then we can go about potentially sort of improving things for that person, giving them another way through which they can meet that need more effectively, that kind of thing. So that applies to all of the functions, but it certainly applies to the sensory function, which is obviously what we're going to be talking about today. So recap around those different functions. So I'm not going to go through all of these in sort of huge amounts of detail. Obviously the sensory function is the one that we're going to be talking about in the most detail today. And this is where the person is engaging in that behaviour in some form of potentially challenging behaviour, because it provides some kind of input in their sensory perceptual pathway. So it looks, sounds, feels, tastes, smells good to that person. It produces pleasure potentially to that person, or it produces comfort, makes the environment more tolerable for that person. Escape would be where someone is engaging in a behaviour to escape or avoid something that they're finding particularly difficult. Obviously attention is when the person maybe is engaging in a behaviour to gain access to interaction or response, some kind of preferred person potentially. And the tangible function is where someone is maybe engaging in a behaviour to gain access to an object, person, activity that they particularly enjoy or desire at that moment in time. So that's just a quick recap around those functions, and just to point out, obviously what we're looking at here in the most detail today is this sensory function. So that's where the person is potentially engaging in behaviour, sometimes challenging behaviour, because it meets some kind of sensory need, some sort of need for self-stimulation. what we're also going to be looking at a little bit are these escape functions as well, because sometimes those behaviours that meet a sensory need are about actually escaping something, escaping some kind of sensory input that person is finding unpleasant or difficult or painful. So so it can sometimes come into the category of being a little bit of a sensory escape as well. And we'll look at the differences between those when we start to talk about what the difference is between hyper and hyposensitive, that kind of thing as we're moving forward. But just sort of to bring it into the context of behavioural function, I wanted to sort of start by having a bit of a recap on that. So obviously this is a webinar, we're not doing lots of sort of sharing and interacting and that kind of thing. So this isn't an exercise where you're going to have to necessarily feed back. It's more sort of a little bit of a sort of thought exercise. So it's about, if you can, take 30 seconds to sit in silence and have a little bit of a think about these questions. So sit where you are, you know, for 30 seconds and think, you know, what can you see and hear in your environment when you're sat there? You know, what noises are going on? Is there a ticking clock? Is the fridge humming? You know, those kinds of things. Take a note of your breathing. Can you sense your heartbeat? Can you hear that? Is there a sensation? How fast is it beating? Can you detect any smells? Maybe really, really subtle smells that you wouldn't necessarily pick up on unless you're really sort of trying to detect them. Are there any lingering tastes in your mouth? Anything that you maybe weren't necessarily aware of? And do any of those senses remind you of anything or make you feel a certain way? So, you know, it's just about sort of sitting in your environment and seeing whether any of that is there, any of that you can pick up upon. So I'll shut up for a minute and just sort of have a listen. So I've got a fridge humming. And I've also got my son homeschooling in the background, which is probably the most sort of obvious sort of background noise that I had managed to kind of filter out as I've been talking to you. But yeah, sort of the fridge hum became a lot more apparent to me when I was sitting and focusing on that sensory environment around me. Have you got anything, Charlie?
The main sound I could hear was what sounded like a TV, and I was thinking, I don't think there's a TV on here, but I think it's your son's homeschooling.
I'm providing you all with that. That's his English teacher. She's quite loud. but yeah, it's just a little bit of a, you know, I think it's sometimes a little bit easier to do this sort of outside of a training session in a sense, isn't it? You know, sort of just sit and think about what's going on around you, what you can perceive through your senses, and how much you're actually filtering out. I think we you know, take for granted actually how effective we are at filtering out some of that sensory input when we're focusing on a particular thing. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we sort of go forward. So first of all, sort of thinking about who has got sensory differences. And the answer to that is we're all different. We all experience the world differently from a sensory perspective. There'll be certain things that some of us are really, really great at filtering out that others just can't. So for example, I work really well in a busy environment. If I go to, I quite like to, back in the day when we could, to take my laptop into Costa Coffee and sit in that sort of buzzy, hummy environment. Like, I find that quite an easy environment to work in. There's something about that sort of white noise, I think, that helps me to focus a little bit, whereas other people would find that really difficult. They'd find it really tricky to work in an environment where there's lots of other sort of sensory stimulation going on.
I'm opposite. I have to have like video silence, like complete no sound. If there's like music on in the background, it's too much for me.
And I mean, it depends on the sort of work I'm doing, but I do like to have my music on. And you know, particularly if I'm not doing something that doesn't involve too much brain power, I like to have my music on as well. That just sort of helps me to focus. The silence sometimes I find a little bit distracting in some way. So we're all different. We've all got sensory differences. We perceive the world differently. And we've all got certain sort of behaviours that maybe would serve a sensory function for us. You know, there might be certain sort of self-stimulatory acts we carry out, whether it's, you know, flicking a pen, whether it's our leg wobbling, all of those kinds of things. So many things we engage in that potentially feel good for us, that make us feel a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more calm, a little bit more at ease within our environments. So what you'll find as we're going through the rest of these slides is that we refer to autism a lot. A lot of the slides are autism focused, and obviously a lot of you guys support a lot of individuals who are have autism diagnoses, so it's really relevant obviously to be talking about autism. I just wanted to make the point that this isn't just about the autistic individuals. While sensory differences are something we see very commonly in autistic individuals, therefore they've been sort of referenced a lot within the slides, it does apply to everybody that you're supporting is going to have certain sensory preferences. So it's about not thinking, oh, they're not autistic, therefore this doesn't apply to them. You know, that's not how we should be thinking. It could be relevant to everybody, what we're focusing on here. Excuse me. But I should also just reference the fact that some of the slides that we're going to be going through have actually been developed by and alongside an autistic individual who's been involved in our autism training. She's a wonderful lady called Lizzie, and we've got her to sort of look over our autism training for us, and she's given us a lot of her sort of perception and experience of the world. So some of the slides actually come from her. So I think that does give them a little bit of added value, doesn't it, having come from someone who's got real lived experience of some of these differences and issues. Cool. Okay, so before we sort of go into the sort of theory, if you like, in relation to these sensory behaviours, we've got a little bit about our case study, and this is Carly Fleischmann. So some of you guys might have already sort of seen videos of her. You might sort of be aware of her. Some of you, she might be completely new to you, but Carly is a pretty inspiring young lady. She's in her early 20s now, so the video is a few years old because she's quite young in the video. But Carly's an autistic young lady. She's unable to speak. She's got sort of motor issues that in relation to her ability to speak, and up until her very sort of early teens, I believe it was, so maybe around the sort of 11 or 12 mark, people assumed that there wasn't much going on for Carly, that she didn't have very much cognitive ability. She wasn't able to communicate at all with the world around her. And actually, it culminated in a situation where she was experiencing quite a lot of pain. And in desperation, somebody, I think it was her dad, who's been really, really supportive of her, put a computer keyboard in front of her. And actually, she typed onto the computer keyboard the words help, or help me, I think it was. And it became apparent that actually she's a really smart young lady. Her IQ has been rated as at around about 130. She's a really advanced intellectual young lady who just hadn't been given the ability to communicate. And once she was able to, she wrote down her experiences. She's written a book. She's quite sort of prominent within the world of autism. And it's quite nice because she gives a voice to those people who aren't able to stand up and talk about their experiences. We've got people like Temple Grandin and a whole range of other really inspiring autistic speakers who can speak about their experiences. Carly's a really good sort of advocate for those people who aren't able to speak. So Carl, the reason I'm introducing Carly in relation to the sensory issues is that there's this really interesting and inspiring little video that I'm about to show you called Carly's Cafe, where we see Carly in that environment that I just described, where I like to do my work, actually, in a coffee shop environment. And there's a few things going on. It's not just the sensory issues that are kind of covered in that, but I think it does really quite cleverly give a depiction of actually how difficult the world can be from a sensory perspective, particularly if you're very oversensitive to things like sound and that kind of thing. So I'm going to play that little video for you guys. It's available freely on the internet, Carly's Cafe. And actually, if you go into the website and access this video, you can move around the cafe, you can move the camera lens so that you're looking at different things as well. It's quite a cool little interactive video, but I'll play that for you now.
I can't wait for a coffee. Oh, hello, barista.
What do you girls want?
Skim soy latte. Taryn, soy can't be skim.
Hot chocolate, orange juice.
No, Dad, I want a coffee. Hot chocolate? Great. So I was thinking of going to Sarah's later. Could you give me a ride?
Yeah, sure. Are you cool with taking your sister?
Yeah. Wait. What? I have my own plane. Okay, I'll see you tonight, okay?
How can I help?
Yeah, so I think that it's a powerful little video, that one, isn't it? I think particularly at the end where it pans out and you see Carly in that environment. But there's quite a few videos like that. Sort of National Autistic Society do quite a few as well, which kind of, I think in some senses put you into that person's shoes. And I think it's quite a valuable experience, I think, sometimes to think about actually some of the environments in which we support people in, you know, that how noisy sometimes they can be and how many things can be going on at once that maybe that person might be finding quite difficult and quite stressful. Yeah, it's just I think a nice little depiction of that particular environment. Coffee shops can be really noisy, can't they? Those coffee machines can be quite sudden and can make a really loud noise, can't they, as well? So that was Carly and Carly's cafe. So we're going to move forward to have a little bit of think more sort of specifically about some of the sensory differences that people might experience and some of the sort of reasons behind that kind of thing. So this slide is about some of the neurological differences. So actually there's been research carried out, ongoing research around particularly autistic people and some of the differences that maybe there might be going on in the brains of people who are autistic. Some work's been carried out looking at sort of brain scans in relation to sensory information. And it's been found that actually there's some differences in this part of the brain called the corpus callosum. I'm not sure if I'm even saying that correctly, but there's actually some evidence that there's some sort of hyperconnectivity in that part of the brain that maybe is accounting for some of that sensory overstimulation that people might experience. And the main difference that you find with autistic people in comparison to neurotypicals, which is, you know, the term that we use to describe people who are non-autistic or, you know, don't have any particular diagnosis. So, you know, the bulk of people who are providing support. Those of us who are neurotypical have got the ability through our brains, through the way that we're wired up slightly differently, to filter out this thing that we're talking about, how we're able to filter out that sensory information that we've got going on around us at most of the time. Not always, you know, I have to turn my stereo down when I'm doing a complicated bit of driving for some reason, but generally we're able to filter out too much sensory information quite effectively. We become habituated to it, so we don't notice it. Our brain sort of deems it as being unimportant to us, so we're quite effective at doing that. Autistic people, because of these brain differences, potentially don't have that filter, which means that the sensory environment can be very intrusive. They're not able to filter out the homeschooling going on behind me in the other room, the hum of the fridge, the flicker of the light, you know, whatever it is. So they might actually be experiencing it more intensely, the you or I might be, and they might not be able to filter it out in the same way that we are able to. That sensory input is pervasively actively processed. So their brain has got to be really busy processing all of this sensory information that's coming in, bombarding that person from all angles and from all the different senses as well. And that's why we quite often see for people, particularly autistic people, but as I say, it's not just, we're not just talking about autistic people here, but sensory overload can have the potential to be a significant trigger for people. And it can be a gradual process. It can build up and build up and build up. And it can get to the point where that person is highly sensitive, and one additional little extra bit of sensory information is just enough to sort of tip that person over the edge, if you like, and it lead to them no longer be able to process and needing to do something to manage that environment more effectively, to escape it or to cover up the thing that they're finding particularly difficult. So it's that difference in filtering sensory information that I think is really, really relevant here. So we're introducing now the concepts of hyper and hypo sensitivity. And then we're going to start to think about the different senses. So the sensory side of things, in relation to sensory function and sensory differences, everything we're talking about here, it's really quite complex. It's really, really complex because we can have so many differences from person to person. It's, you can make a sweeping statement that, the bulk of the people that you're potentially supporting may have some sort of sensory difference, but what that looks like from individual to individual is going to be so different. And hyper and hypo sensitivity are kind of the opposite to each other, and we'll have a look at that in a sec. So hypersensitivity is when somebody is oversensitive to some kind of sensory stimulation. So that might be, we're going to look at some more specific examples in relation to each of the senses in a little bit, but clothes rubbing against somebody's skin, quite a lot of people maybe have difficulty, if they're hypersensitivity to things like touch, would have difficulty with particular labels or seams on clothing. And it's, again, not being able to filter out that sensation would be really problematic as well. But actually, a really good example, I think it was an OT who gave me this particular example in relation to oversensitivity to clothing, is when we put our socks on in the morning, we might feel them for a couple of seconds, but we very quickly filter out that sensation of having the elastic around our ankle, don't we? We're quite good at just filtering that out. Unless it's really, really tight and uncomfortable, we don't notice it for the rest of the day. Whereas someone who's oversensitive or hypersensitive to that particular sensation, and who doesn't have the ability to filter it out, could experience it all day, the whole day long, be feeling that sensation, and potentially it's very uncomfortable or even painful for them because of that oversensitivity. So that was, I think, quite a nice example that was provided for me that I quite often use in training now, because it does make me think. It's quite a good way of sort of making you think about some of the things that people maybe find quite difficult.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, go for it, Charlie.
Another kind of thing, I don't know if I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but is then not being able to do anything about it. So I don't like labels in my clothes, but I can take it off and cut it out, or I can ask someone else to cut it out for me. So then I've got rid of the problem straight away. Whereas somebody that can't communicate that they want the label, they've got that irritating them all the time, but they can't explain or can't do it themselves to get rid of that irritating feeling. So that's like the other, in addition to not just having the uncomfortable feeling, but then also not being able to do anything about it yourself.
Not being able to say, look, I'm getting really upset because my socks are really hurting. It's really uncomfortable. The label's really, that sort of light sensation on the skin can actually be, it's described sometimes as painful, but autistic people have said that themselves, that particularly light touch can be experienced almost as a needle in the skin, that kind of thing. So yeah, not being able to actually potentially express that. I mean, if you bought a new item of clothing and you're wearing it on the train or something, and you can't take that label out, it gets worse, doesn't it? It gets so much worse because you can't do anything about it. So yeah, that, like I say, even light touch, if someone who's oversensitive could, like I said, be painful, be really difficult. And sounds as well. So household appliances, vehicles, animals, crowds, crying babies. All of those kinds of things could be experienced almost in a painful and uncomfortable way for someone who's oversensitive. So for people who sort of fit into that category, we might need to think about sensory distractions being removed in order for them to be able to actually concentrate. So if we're asking something of that person, if we're introducing something that's new or difficult or challenging as a task we want them to complete, then we need to think, how do we make this environment as comfortable as possible for them, knowing that they're actually probably hearing the drip of the tap, or they're hearing the hum of the fridge, and all those kinds of things. We're going to look in more detail at some of the other approaches that we can use around sensory changes. So hyposensitivity is the opposite. It's the opposite side of the coin. These are the people who are undersensitive to certain forms of sensory stimulation. So they might show an unusually high tolerance to stimulation. And you generally find, the difference between these two is if someone's oversensitive to something, they try and escape or avoid it. If they're undersensitive, they're seekers, they're sensory seekers. So they seek out that constant stimulation by taking part in the activities that are going to provide them with access to that. So the loud music, the intense exercise, the water play, all of those kinds of things. And they also might not notice things that might be causing, those of us who don't have that undersensitivity, things like pain or things being too hot or too cold, they might not experience in the same way. So I supported someone who fell off the sofa and transpired eventually that he actually broke his collarbone by falling off the sofa. And he spent a lot of his days sat cross-legged, sat on his hands. He used to like to sit on his hands, so with his arms down like that. And he was just going about his business, still with his arms in that position, sat on his hands, which must have been pulling on it. And he was rocking and he just didn't seem to perceive that particular pain. It took a really long time for the medical professionals to sort of believe actually that there was some kind of injury for him, because he wasn't experiencing. He also self-injured. He was a very self-injurious gentleman, so it did fit in with that sort of undersensitivity, particularly to touch, for that particular individual. So so people who are undersensitive might need high intensity sensory input. They might need to be given plenty of access to that to prepare them for those times when they need to focus a little bit more. So making sure that they're not in a state of sensory deprivation, really filling up their cup with loads and loads of sensory stimulation, so that they don't feel like they've got to go and seek it when they're sort of engaging in those more focused tasks. So they're the two sort of opposites, as I say, hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity. However, one thing that makes it even more confusing is the fact that you don't just stick Charlie in the oversensitive and Clark in the undersensitive. It's not that a person is oversensitive to everything or undersensitive to everything. You might have somebody who's oversensitive to sound, but undersensitive to touch, and then oversensitive to taste. It can be a really complicated profile from person to person. And you might also have people who are oversensitive to certain kinds of touch, but undersensitive to other sorts of touch. It can actually be different within the same sense. So it's not as clear cut as you're either in that box or that box. It's a really complicated sort of profile that we need to kind of get a good understanding of from person to person to really understand their sensory needs effectively. So we've introduced these two concepts. We'll have a little think now more specifically about the senses and what hyper or hyposensitivity might look like in relation to the different senses that we all experience. So the first question, obviously, is a hypothetical question. Don't anyone sort of butt in and answer the question, that's absolutely fine. But how many senses are there? Is it just the 5 senses that we learn at preschool? Vision, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. And the answer to that is no. There's more than 5 senses. Again, just to overcomplicate things even more, we're not just talking about 5 senses. These are really important, these 5. These are obviously really, really relevant, and people can be over or undersensitive in any of these senses. But there are some other things to think about on top of that. So those basic 5 senses are important, but they don't capture all of our sensory experiences. So we're going to be looking at 3 additional senses as well today. So we're not just going to be looking at those 5, we're also going to be looking at these 3 our proprioception, our vestibular sense, and this sense called interoception as well. So that makes 8 in total. And I think there's arguments that potentially there are other ones as well, but these are the sort of main 8 that we sort of ordinarily look at in relation to sensory behaviours. So the next slide, I'm going to tell you what these 3 are, just in case you're thinking, oh, I'm not sure what those words actually mean. I will explain them on the next slide. So there's more than 5 senses, and as I said, we've got these 3 additional senses on top of our generic, 5 senses. Our sense of proprioception is basically our awareness of where our body is in space, our awareness of where we are and where we end and the rest of the world begins. That's generally what we're talking about when we're talking about proprioception. So where we are in space, our bodies. The vestibular system, this is the thing that's located in our inner ears. And that's responsible for our sense of spatial orientation, balance and posture. So I normally sort of, I'm thinking this one's sort of sense of space. So where we are in relation to space. The vestibular system, I kind of think of as balance. Our sense of balance is probably the easiest way to kind of remember that. So things like our fine gross motor skills, particularly relevant to this system. And then the sense of, this is the newest one, I'd say, I mean, it's always been there, and it's always been a difference, but it's the one that's probably the most recently become focused on a little bit more, particularly for autistic people. And this is our sense of interoception. And this is our ability to interpret our own body signals. So our body will signal when we're hungry, when we're thirsty, when we need the loo, when we're tired, when we're too hot or too cold, all of those kinds of things. And actually, that there's evidence that people, again, particularly people with autism, might experience those differently, might not have the same sort of sense that they're full, or that actually they're hungry, or that they're too hot or too cold. And that's certainly, I think, people I've supported in the past, it fits with some of the ways in which they've presented, that they've not been able to interpret those signals as effectively as someone who maybe isn't experiencing that sensory difference. So these, as I say, these 3 additional senses, so where we are in space, our balance, and our ability to interpret those signals. So they're the 3 other senses that we're going to look at. So what we're now going to do is look at each of those 8 senses and how it might present if you're over, which is hyper, or under sensitive. So it might be that you read some examples of some of the people that you're supporting, and it could be actually, yeah, that is why they do what they're doing. I just want to put the caveat out there that unless we carry out a functional assessment, there could be other reasons as well. If we're not saying that everybody who does this is definitely doing it to meet a sensory need. And there could be other things that people who are oversensitive in taste, for example, would do that aren't on this list. So just to put that out there. But these are some examples of potentially how it might present it as a sensory behaviour if someone's got that particular difference. So starting off, thinking about taste, if someone is hyper or oversensitive to taste, they're more likely to want to avoid things that have a strong taste to them. So their food is going to be plain. They're not going to be experimenting with lots of funky flavours. It's going to be very bland, very plain flavoured foods. And they might find things like toothpaste difficult as well, because that's got quite a strong flavour. So that might be what you sometimes see. Because remember, people who are oversensitive or hypersensitive are avoiding, they're trying to escape or avoid that sensory input. By contrast, someone who's undersensitive for taste, they're going to be eating all sorts of things that have got a strong flavour potentially. They might like the spicy foods, the curries. I used to work with someone who would put so much pepper and condiments on their food. They had a really, so they did like to experiment with lots of different flavours and things like that. Fizzy Haribo sweets and things that have got a strong flavour are quite appealing to people who maybe fit this category. You might sometimes find that they regurgitate, because again, that's a strong flavour. Mouthing objects and choose on clothes, all those kinds of things. So those are some examples of how that might potentially present So that, again, you might be sort of thinking about people that you're supporting and they potentially fit some of those categories. For sight, for vision, if someone's oversensitive, again, they're going to be trying to avoid too much of that sort of visual input, aren't they? They're maybe going to be more likely to look down, to cover their eyes, to squint. They might be sensitive to light, and certain sights or colours might be triggering. So that's where we think about if we're wearing, you know, patterned clothing, so lots of stripes, lots of checks, lots of sort of vibrant colours might be quite difficult for someone who's oversensitive to sight. So it's just having a bit of a think about that. You know, if you want someone to be able to focus or concentrate on what you're presenting, if they're oversensitive and they're going to be distracted by what you're wearing or what's going on around them, we need to think about how we can tailor that environment to make it a little bit easier for them. People who are undersensitive to sight, they're going to be trying to stimulate, as I say, that particular sense. So they'll be attracted to light, to reflections. They might move fingers in front of their eyes or look intensely at things. There was one person I used to support who used to pace very fast, looking down at the floor. And actually, I feel, I mean, obviously I didn't know because he wasn't able to actually tell me, but I feel like he was really getting some stimulation out of the carpet moving fast, because it was quite a patterned, it wasn't a very autism friendly place that he was living. It was a really patterned carpet, and he used to do the same in the car. He liked the movement of the things in the car as well. And in relation to hearing, obviously if you're oversensitive, that's where you've got people who are going to block their ears. They're going to be needing to wear their ear protectors potentially in some situations. They might find noisy places quite difficult. Whereas our undersensitive sensory seekers are going to be potentially making lots of loud noise. They might be talking loudly. They might want the TV and music on as loud as possible. They might be into some really sort of thumping dance music, that kind of thing. They might have difficulty understanding or remembering instructions, and they might have difficulty responding to some of those verbal cues as well, because they're not necessarily taking it in the same way. I think just a little caveat to the makes loud noises thing there is actually you do sometimes find that the people who are oversensitive also might make their own loud noises to cover up, to mask some of the noises that are going on around them that they find quite difficult. So just to sort of be aware of that, sometimes it could be that person is making that loud noise because it's predictable, it's something they've got control of. They've got the on and off switch for that noise, haven't they? So sometimes you find that might also go into the other category there. So moving through the senses, so touch. If someone's oversensitive to touch, again, they're going to avoid it, aren't they? They're going to try and avoid touch. They're going to strip their clothing off sometimes, potentially, particularly if it's got those seams and labels that they find difficult. They might not want to engage in personal care. That might be something they find quite difficult. Showers can be quite difficult sometimes for people who have got that oversensitivity, or they might need the shower to be a little bit more sort of powerful. Sometimes if it's too sort of a light drip, can be more painful than a much more sort of powerful sensation. So just sort of being aware of that sometimes. If they're undersensitive, again, trying to seek touch, they might like lots of textured objects, lots of tactile interaction, stroking their own skin, touching objects a lot. They might have that high tolerance to pain as well, potentially. And you might sometimes find that people self-injure to stimulate that sense as well. There's a link between self-injury and actually the sort of the neurotransmitters your brain produces. It can actually produce a sort of pleasurable sensation for some people who self-injure. So you might sometimes find that self-injury has a sensory function. Just to say, it's not always the case, of course, and we'd need to look into that in more detail. There can be other reasons, obviously, that people self-injure, but you might sometimes find it's because of that. I think the other one with touch sometimes is physical interventions. I've worked with a couple of people actually who, got into that situation where the physical restraint is the way through which they're gaining access to that touch, to that deep pressure hold that they're finding sort of calming and pleasurable sometimes. So just to sometimes be aware of that. A lot of people obviously find physical intervention really distressing and difficult, but But some people actually might be seeking out, particularly if that's the only physical interaction that they're getting. So again, something just to sort of be aware of. Smell, so sort of moving through those first 5 senses here. Someone who's oversensitive might refuse to work with people who wear strong scents. So again, that's something I'm always aware of when I'm sort of visiting places. As a rule, I don't put the Daisy perfume on or anything like that. And you know, I just sort of think it's easier just not to in these sorts of situations.
I think it's a really weird one. So I have been traveling for a year. I'm very lucky to be able to do that, and I didn't take any perfume with me, so I didn't wear perfume for a year. And now whenever I walk past somebody that's got perfume on, I can smell it so strongly, and I'm like, oh, they've got so much perfume on, and they haven't. It's just because I haven't worn it for so long, but it now smells really, really strongly to me.
Yeah, so you sort of desensitizing yourself to it a little bit now. But yeah, there definitely it can be experienced really powerfully, can't it, particularly for someone who's oversensitive to smell. And undersensitive. I've worked with there was one guy I worked with who he loved his not antiperspirant, his what's it called that men wear, aftershave. That was it. He loved his aftershaves, and it was a big treat for him to get new aftershaves. He'd save up, and when you went and visited, he'd take you into his room and spray his aftershaves and get you to smell them all and this kind of thing. He was you know, big on smells, and that was really cool actually. But people might not also notice those unpleasant or harmful smells. They might try and create smells to stimulate that particular sense, and sometimes that might be things like smearing and that kind of thing as well that you might see. So there's some examples. So moving into those other 3 senses. So again, this is we're looking at movement, body position, where our body is in space with this sense. People who are oversensitive in proprioception might start to put their bodies into strange positions. They might move in a stiff way or find it difficult to get comfortable. You might find those kinds of things. Whereas if someone's undersensitive, you see things like hand flapping, finger splaying, toe walking, wall hugging, sort of jumping, crashing, like sort of rough play, being squeezed tight, all of those kinds of things. Similarities with the touch and that need for sort of stimulation, but it's more about movement in this particular example. So physical intervention could again come into this one, couldn't it? But you see quite a lot of the things that we describe as stimming behaviours, as self-stimulatory behaviours that people might engage in to make themselves feel good and to regulate themselves. So some of those examples are there, aren't they? Last couple of senses. So vestibular, so it's our sense of balance. Someone who's oversensitive is more likely to lose balance easily. They bump into objects. They have difficulty walking, even particularly on uneven surfaces, and things like escalators and lifts can be quite difficult as well for those people. So something to be aware of. People who are undersensitive, again, are going to be movement seekers. They like spinning, they like rocking, swinging, trampolines and roundabouts, all those sorts of things that are going to stimulate that inner ear, that sort of sense of balance that we've all got. Roller coasters and things. There might be those sort of adrenaline junkies who like some of those more active things that I don't like. And finally, interoception, so our sense of our own internal body signals. So someone who's oversensitive, they might feel things more intensely and more overwhelmingly. So they might get really angry or panicky if they feel a little bit hungry or a little bit thirsty. They might, I'm working with someone at the moment actually who, as soon as he slightly needs a toilet, has to use a toilet, and he has to that second. It's quite difficult sort of for his team that are supporting him. You know, the slightest sort of sensation, obviously in his bladder, he's experiencing probably quite intensely, and he wants it to go away. So it's that kind of thing. Whereas the opposite to that for the people who are undersensitive, if they don't notice that they're feeling hungry or that they're full, they don't notice that they're thirsty, hot or cold, or that they need a toilet. They get those signals confused sometimes as well. So they might mistake thirst for hunger. They might not realize they're becoming ill. They might need lots of prompting around some of these things as well. So that's where, you know, these descriptions, people pop into my head sort of as I'm reading them. It's certainly something that I've experienced in my experience with people, particularly autistic people, but other individuals as well. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight into those differences, the hyper and the hypo sensitivity, and those 8 different senses as well. And hopefully it's also demonstrated to you how complex this issue actually is for people. So and just to sort of tie in, this kind of ties in with this concept I was talking about around filtering and our ability to filter. So this is this thing we call sort of hyper focus. So the autistic person's ability to hyper focus means that they can give complete and absolute attention to the topic or sensory input of interest. They might master it, in fact. It becomes their all and everything. They're able to completely focus on that. And that's actually can be a real strength. It can make people become incredibly skilled at certain techniques, at certain aspects. And that's why we see, sometimes people develop really almost savant-like abilities based on this ability to focus. Obviously, the downside to that is it can be really difficult to switch, to sort of switch away from that need for sensory input, that particular activity or task that are doing that meets that need for them. It can be really difficult for them to switch attention, and that's just something to be aware of. Obviously, we know that people, particularly autistic people, can struggle to multitask. And yeah, this sort of example here, people aren't necessarily purposefully ignoring you. Maybe sometimes they are, but quite often it's potentially because that person's so focused on the thing that they're doing, or the need that they're meeting through that particular behavior, that they can't hear you at all. They're not taking any of that information, other information in. So that's just a little bit of food for thought around that hyper focus. So final couple of slides are around what we might need to do to support sensory behaviours effectively. So just a couple more slides, and then obviously if you've got any questions, then feel free to ask. But the first thing obviously we would need to make sure we do is ascertain if we've got a challenging behaviour that we want to know if it's meeting a sensory need. We should never just assume that it's a sensory need. Even if it was in one of those boxes on one of those slides, there could be other reasons that people are engaging in those behaviours. So really, it'd be good practice to carry out some form of functional assessment to determine whether it is definitely a sensory behaviour or not. If we establish that there is some kind of sensory need, whether it's an escape from sensory or whether it's that they're trying to gain access to sensory stimulation, we need to get a better picture of what that person's sensory profile looks like. So how are they in relation to those 8 senses? Is there a particular sense that they've got a difference in that's causing this particular behaviour to occur? You might need to bring in a professional like a therapist to carry out a sensory assessment in those instances. What need are they trying to meet through that behaviour? That's what we want to establish, isn't it? What need are they trying to meet through that behaviour? And then once we've got that information, that's when we can start planning a little bit around how we might intervene. It's really difficult. Sensory behaviours are really difficult behaviours to make a difference to, because that person doesn't necessarily need another individual to provide that. It's self-stimulation. It can happen when they're on their own. They don't necessarily need a middleman to meet that need. And it can quite often be something they've been doing for a really long period of time, which can be quite difficult to sort of break that pattern. So what we need to do is find some other way through which they can meet that need in a way that's not necessarily harmful to other people. Activities that meet that same sensory need. The difficulty is they need to be just as easy or easier for that person to do. They need to be readily available, and they need a lot of time to get used to using this new alternative method. So it can be a really difficult thing to actually make a change with. It takes a lot of focus, and you quite often need some expert guidance around some of those alternative activities you could introduce. And it's about being creative. Obviously, if you've got an idea about that person's particular sensory needs, if they're undersensitive in a particular sense, for example, think about what could be a really fun way of getting that person to get access to that stimulation in some other way. quite often you need more than one as well. You need more than one sort of option that you can introduce for that person. And with all of these things, and with any behavioural intervention really, empathy is obviously hugely important. Having an understanding of what that person is going through and why they're doing what they're doing. Persistence, we need to it's not going to change overnight. You need to persist. Obviously not indefinitely. If things aren't changing for a long period of time, you might need to review them. But if things don't change immediately, that doesn't mean it's not going to change. You need to sort of be persistent and consistent as well as a team. I think that's really important too. So final slide is around more sort of general sensory guidance, and this is come from Lizzie, as I say, that our associate who is autistic herself. So and she's got 2 autistic sons. So this is based on her experience and on her experience with her autistic sons. First of all, individualized support plan, which all carers and professionals are aware of. So ideally, we want to get to the position where we've got a really clear understanding of the sensory needs of all the people that we're supporting and how best to meet those particular needs. And it'll be very person specific when each individual will have a very different sort of sensory need, sensory profile. We want to be creating living environments that suit that need to the best of our ability. You will work in shared homes where lots of people live together with a variety of different sensory needs. So it's always going to be difficult. There's going to be some juggling going on around. If someone's a sort of undersensitive in one sense of vision, for example, and other people are oversensitive, then finding the right sort of lighting, the right level of stimulation can sometimes be a bit difficult. But think about how people's bedrooms, for example, are tailored, that need for light, space, privacy, noise, all of those kinds of things. Help them to organise their favourite possessions and belongings according to their preferences, as I'm sure you will do anyway. Communicate key information in advance and give reminders. So just bearing in mind all of that, everything that's going on around that person, all of that sensory stimulation, that difficulty filtering out, making sure we give people the best chance to understand what's happening and when and why. So using as many visuals as possible is really important. Provide a quiet, safe space to retreat to ward off or recover from sensory overloads. Allowing that autistic person to leave the room and carry out tasks in a quieter or favoured space wherever possible. So again, particularly those times when we're presenting something that's going to be potentially a bit difficult for them, we need to think, are they in the best environment for us to be presenting this task? If they're not, what environment would be a better environment? Build movement and exercise breaks into every day, again, depending on that person's particular sensory need. And thinking about those sort of sensory toys, stimming aids, that kind of thing that might be, really useful to that person, having those available, as and when necessary for that individual. So that's more sort of general guidance around those sensory behaviours. But sort of coming to the end of the hour, does anybody have any questions about any of that sort of stuff? I feel like I could have talked probably for another 3 hours about some of those things, certainly given more examples, but any questions in the chat or anything that anyone wants to have?
I have one question.
Go for it, Clark.
I was just wondering, although we're starting out with finding out if they're hyper or hyposensitive, is it a possibility that over time it changes from one to the other?
Yes, yeah. Probably one thing I didn't mention actually in the way that you can be hyper and hyposensitive in different senses. The same sense can change. You're completely right, depending on the environment, depending on the context throughout a person's life. It can change. It's not that someone's going to permanently fit into that certain little box, that certain category. So yeah, you have a really good point actually, Clark. It is at that complex. It can change, definitely. Yes. Which obviously makes things a bit trickier, doesn't it, in terms of getting that understanding. And that's, it's not about just doing one assessment and that's sticking with that person for the rest of their lives, is it? It's about knowing the person, isn't it? It comes into rapport building and getting a good knowledge of that person and what their needs are. And sensory assessments are a really good start, but I think you guys who spend day in, day out with the people that you're supporting, you can really pick up on those slight sort of subtle things, the subtle behaviours they engage in, the the particular sensory preferences that they have. So it's about, you know, as a team, kind of building up a really clear picture of what each individual looks like in relation to those needs and how it changes.